Imagine standing at the altar, ready to marry, only to discover the woman beside you has been lying about her very identity for 20 years. That's where our story begins. But first, tell me, where are you tuning in from? Leave it in the comments. I'd love to know. The year was 1915, and Davenport, Iowa, was the sort of place where everyone's history lived in plain sight. A town of 5,000, it thrived on rail freight, gossip, and Sunday sermons. People knew who you were, where you came from, and how long you'd been standing in the same pew. Margaret Conway knew this better than anyone. She had arrived in Davenport 17 years earlier with a baby on her hip and a widow's black dress on her back. At the time she was only 20, and her story, that she had lost both husband and sister in the same winter, was met with murmurs of sympathy. She never bothered to correct the town when it assumed the baby was her late sister's child. If anything, she encouraged it. Sympathy kept questions at bay. Now she was 37, still striking, her figure trim, her hair dark though threaded with silver she carefully disguised. Years of careful attention to dress and manner had given her the look of a woman younger than she was. She knew well that appearance was half a battle in a small town. Arthur Bellamy, new foreman's assistant at the foundry, was 30, broad-shouldered and steady-eyed. He was everything Davenport admired: industrious, ambitious, sober in his habits. When Margaret made his acquaintance at a church social, she introduced Evelyn not as her daughter, but as her niece, the same story she had carried for nearly 2 decades. "This is Evelyn, my late sister's girl," she said, her voice smooth, assured. Evelyn, now 19, inclined her head with quiet grace. Arthur studied them both. Margaret's composure was magnetic. She had a way of drawing the room into orbit around her. Evelyn was different, quieter, her gaze slipping downward as if accustomed to shrinking from notice. The resemblance between them was obvious, but Arthur accepted the explanation without protest. It was not impossible for an older sister to have had a child so much later in life, and in a town like Davenport, politeness often outweighed curiosity. But as Arthur took Margaret's hand in farewell, he found himself glancing again at Evelyn. Something in her silence tugged at him. Margaret's mistake was not in the lie itself. It was in believing Davenport's silence meant belief. The weeks following that first meeting unfolded in a rhythm of church socials, shared walks after service, and polite conversations across whitewashed fences. To Davenport, it seemed natural enough that Arthur Bellamy would begin to court Margaret Conway. He was, after all, a man of means and respect, and Margaret, though not young, carried herself with refinement and ambition. Yet, under the surface, the arrangement was less seamless than appearances suggested. Margaret worked tirelessly to present herself as Arthur's equal. She chose dresses in muted but youthful colors, styled her hair in ways that softened her features, and spoke eagerly of books and politics, subjects that set her apart from most of Davenport's women, whose conversations were bounded by household matters. When Arthur mentioned the rumblings of war in Europe, Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright. "America cannot stay untouched forever," she said. "The world is smaller than we think. We must be ready." Arthur admired her intelligence. She was not timid, nor idle, and he respected that. And yet, he noticed things. Margaret's claim to 30 years sat uneasily with him. Her face could pass, perhaps, but her hands told another story, hands that had borne years of labor, even if well manicured now. When she laughed, he sometimes caught a weariness behind it, the kind of heaviness that comes only with time. It was Evelyn, however, who troubled him most. At 19, she was no child, yet she moved as though constantly afraid of taking up space. When Margaret spoke, Evelyn listened without interruption. When Margaret instructed, Evelyn obeyed without hesitation. Her silences were not the easy silences of kinship, but the taut silences of someone holding her tongue. Arthur began to notice the subtleties. Margaret rarely framed Evelyn as an equal. "Fetch the hymnals, dear," she would say sharply in front of others, or "Stand straighter, Evelyn, it reflects poorly on the family." Such remarks might pass as harmless guidance from a guardian, but they carried a force that unsettled Arthur. One Sunday after service, as they walked home together, Arthur fell into step beside Evelyn while Margaret lingered behind, speaking animatedly with the minister. "Do you enjoy Davenport?" he asked her, searching for a thread of her own voice. Evelyn glanced at him, her eyes pale and guarded. "It is what it is," she said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, "I have never known another place." Arthur studied her. There was no bitterness in her tone, but neither was there joy. It was the kind of answer that seemed to carry more beneath it than it revealed. Before he could press further, Margaret rejoined them, slipping her arm through Arthur's. "You mustn't take Evelyn too seriously," she said with a bright smile. "She has always been quiet, a dreamer. Shy girls need firm direction." Evelyn lowered her eyes, and Arthur felt a flicker of unease. That evening, as he sat in his rented room above the general store, Arthur reflected on the day. Margaret intrigued him, her intelligence, her charm, but the picture she painted of Evelyn as a dependent niece seemed ill-fitting. Evelyn's silence did not strike him as mere shyness. It felt deliberate, as though her words had been taken from her before she could even speak them. Arthur was not a man easily fooled. He had worked in rail yards and factories since he was 16, and he had learned to read men's faces to know whom he could trust. Margaret's story was polished, but he had begun to notice the edges where polish wore thin. And yet, he did not challenge her. Not yet. In Davenport, reputations were brittle things. To accuse Margaret of deception without proof would be to risk his own standing. Instead, he chose to watch more closely. Meanwhile, Evelyn carried her own private turmoil. Each time Margaret introduced her as "my niece," a heat rose in her chest, half shame, half anger. She longed to speak the truth, but she knew too well the price of defiance. Margaret's authority at home was ironclad, her punishments swift and severe, if not with a hand, then with a lash of words that left Evelyn rawer than any blow. Still, Evelyn found small acts of resistance. She lingered at the market to exchange a few words with neighbours out of Margaret's earshot. She allowed herself brief glances at Arthur, glances that hinted at longing but also at a need to be seen, to be understood. They were fleeting rebellions, but rebellions nonetheless. And so the fragile arrangement continued, Margaret dazzling, Arthur observing, Evelyn enduring. Davenport accepted the picture at face value, but gossip stirred beneath, as it always did. In a town where truth travelled by whisper, the smallest crack could widen into scandal. Margaret believed she had built her lie on firm ground, but Arthur's doubts and Evelyn's quiet unrest were the first hairline fractures in the foundation. By the time summer unfurled its heavy heat across Davenport, the whispers had taken root. At church suppers, in the millinery shop, in the barber's chair, tongues wagged over the Conway household. At first the talk was mild. "Strange," Mrs. Talcott remarked one afternoon at the grocer's, "how much that girl resembles her aunt. Same eyes, same way of holding her chin." Her companion replied with a knowing nod. Resemblance runs strong in families, but others were less charitable. Mrs. Callahan, whose memory stretched further back than most, recalled tending Margaret when she had first arrived in town nearly 2 decades earlier. She was scarcely more than a girl herself, she told the butcher's wife, and carrying an infant. Said it was her late sister's child, but I never knew she'd had a sister at all. Seems a queer story, doesn't it? The gossip rippled outward. Some excused it. After all, families were often tangled, and who was to say what arrangements tragedy might force? But others clung to suspicion. In a town as small as Davenport, the truth of one's past mattered as much as the crops in the field or the balance in the bank. Arthur heard the whispers too. They reached him in the barber's chair, in the low mutterings of co-workers at the foundry, in the lingering looks of men who thought him a fool. At first he dismissed them as small-town spite, the idle talk of people with nothing better to do. But as the weeks passed, he could not deny the way the story pressed against his own observations. Margaret's explanation of Evelyn as her niece had seemed plausible enough at the start. Yet Arthur could not shake the memory of Evelyn's eyes when she spoke of never knowing another place, or the too sharp way Margaret corrected her in public. Sisters rarely commanded one another so, and nieces did not obey so instantly. It was the rhythm of mother and daughter, no matter what words wrapped it. One evening, after walking Margaret and Evelyn home from service, Arthur lingered outside the iron gate. Margaret excused herself to fetch a handkerchief, leaving him and Evelyn alone in the lamplight. "Miss Evelyn," he said carefully, "do you mind if I ask you something?" She looked startled, her fingers tightening on the shawl at her shoulders. "If it is proper," she murmured. Arthur hesitated. He was not a man to wound with bluntness. "Do you ever wish to live elsewhere? Chicago, perhaps? Or farther?" Evelyn's lips parted, and for the briefest moment her guarded expression gave way to longing. "Every day," she whispered. Then, as though realizing too much had slipped, she lowered her eyes. "But it is not for me to say." Arthur studied her, unsettled. That a young woman should speak so, without joy, without hope, was not natural. Yet before he could ask more, Margaret reappeared, brisk and smiling, her hand slipping through his arm as if Evelyn had never spoken. That night, Arthur lay awake, troubled by her words. Meanwhile, Margaret grew increasingly vigilant. She was not blind to the whispers in town, nor to the way Arthur's eyes sometimes lingered on Evelyn with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She redoubled her efforts, pressing herself into the role of confident, lively woman. She arranged gatherings at the house, served cordial in fine glasses, laughed with a brightness that dared anyone to contradict her youth. To Arthur, she seemed almost too eager, as though performing for him alone. It impressed him, but it also raised unease. He admired her strength, yet he began to wonder what shadows that strength was built upon. Evelyn, meanwhile, shifted subtly. She no longer wept in silence when Margaret scolded her. Instead, she withdrew further into herself, her quietness taking on the quality of resistance. When Margaret told her to fetch something, she obeyed, but with a slowness that was deliberate. When Margaret dismissed her opinions, Evelyn no longer blushed with shame, but held her tongue with a faint, steady defiance. Arthur noticed. It was Mrs. Callahan, however, who noticed most. She had seen enough births, enough secrets, enough women remaking their stories to recognize a lie when she saw one. Each Sunday she sat 3 pews behind the Conways, watching Margaret with narrowed eyes, watching Evelyn, watching Arthur. And as Davenport's whispers grew louder, Mrs. Callahan began quietly collecting her memories, knitting them together into a certainty that would one day break into the open. By autumn, the leaves in Davenport burned with copper and gold, but in the Conway household The air grew tense. Arthur's visits were more frequent, yet less easy. Margaret continued to dazzle, organizing suppers, reciting poetry, speaking with the conviction of a woman who refused to fade into widowhood. But Arthur no longer listened with unbroken admiration. He watched. He measured. He compared what Margaret claimed with what Evelyn revealed in her silences. One Sunday after church, Margaret invited Arthur to supper. She wore a gown of pale blue, carefully chosen to soften the sharpness of her age, and she spoke brightly of the sermon. "Pastor Whitlow is right, you know," she said, slicing bread with precise movements. "This country cannot pretend the war is far away. We must be vigilant. Men of strength, men like you, Arthur, may soon be needed." Arthur nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Margaret's hand trembled slightly when she poured the wine. He wondered if it was age or nerves. Evelyn sat quietly, folding napkins after each course, her gaze flickering between them. Arthur noticed how she tensed when Margaret placed a hand on his arm, how her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed shut again. After supper, Margaret excused herself to fetch coffee, leaving Arthur and Evelyn alone in the lamplight. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on her hands. "You work very hard for your aunt," Arthur said gently. Evelyn's hands stilled. "She has done much for me," she replied softly. Then, after a pause, she added, "But she requires much as well." Arthur leaned forward. "Does she ever let you choose for yourself? Where to go? What to do?" Her eyes lifted to his, full of something raw. Fear, longing, perhaps both. "Choice is not always ours," she whispered. And then Margaret returned, the tray in her hands, her smile sharp enough to silence them both. Margaret poured coffee, her voice smooth. "You will find Evelyn too modest, Arthur. She owes me much, it is true, but modesty in a young woman is no fault. Better a quiet disposition than one prone to frivolity." Arthur inclined his head, but his unease deepened. Margaret's words carried the ring of justification, not truth. The town, meanwhile, grew restless with talk. The men at the foundry asked Arthur slyly whether he was courting the widow or the girl. Women in the pews whispered that Evelyn was kept like a servant, not a niece. And always Mrs. Callahan watched, her eyes keen. She remembered too well the winter Margaret arrived in Davenport, a swaddled infant in her arms, no sister in sight. She kept her counsel, but each whisper she heard confirmed what she already knew. Arthur found himself cornered by the gossip. To defend Margaret seemed naive, to agree with the town felt dishonorable, and so he said little, keeping his doubts to himself, even as they grew sharper with each passing week. Evelyn, for her part, began to change. Her silence was no longer the silence of submission, but of calculation. She delayed her responses to Margaret, she allowed herself longer glances at Arthur, and once, just once, she let herself smile when Margaret's back was turned. Arthur saw it, and though he could not yet put words to the truth, he felt the foundation beneath Margaret's story shifting. The lie had held for nearly 2 decades, but it was no longer firm. Cracks had opened, and in Davenport, even the smallest crack was enough for the whole town to peer through. The bells of First Presbyterian rang bright that October morning. Davenport streets, still golden with leaves, bustled with townsfolk eager for spectacle. Margaret Conway was to marry Arthur Bellamy, the foundry's rising man. She had let slip the news herself, in careful phrases at sewing circles and Sunday socials, as though it were already a fact. Margaret had been meticulous. She had walked into the Scott County clerk's office weeks earlier, her papers in order, her pen steady. Her birth year, written boldly, made her 29, not 37. She presented Evelyn's baptismal certificate as proof of kinship, niece, not daughter. The clerk, distracted and overworked, did not press the matter. Margaret left with license in hand, her smile hidden beneath a veil. Now the church filled with neighbours, curiosity buzzing as loud as the bees in the last asters of the year. Whispers carried through the pews. Too old. Too strange. What of the girl? Mrs. Callahan sat 3 rows back, her lips pressed thin, her memory sharper than any document Margaret could forge. Arthur stood at the front, steady in appearance though his stomach churned. His doubts, sharpened over weeks, weighed heavy. He had not spoken them aloud, not even to Evelyn, but today they felt nearer than the ring in his pocket. Margaret entered on Evelyn's arm, veiled in cream satin that disguised the lines at her temples. Evelyn moved stiffly, her face pale, her hand cold against Margaret's. To the congregation they might have looked like sisters indeed, alike in dark hair and bearing, but to Arthur the resemblance was too exact, too practised. Reverend Whitlow opened his book, his voice calm at first. He had read the license, noted the ages, but the rumours in town had reached him too. A minister in Davenport could not stand apart from the talk of his flock. As he began the familiar words, his eyes drifted again to the paper in his hand, then to Margaret, then to Evelyn. When he came to the moment of binding, he faltered. The silence stretched. Margaret's head lifted sharply beneath her veil. "Reverend," she prompted, her voice sweet but edged. Whitlow closed the book. "I cannot," he said slowly, his voice carrying to the rafters, "proceed under doubt. Before God and before this congregation, truth must bind stronger than paper." The murmur began at once, low, urgent, spreading. Margaret stiffened, her fingers clutching Evelyn's arm. And then Mrs. Callahan rose. Her voice cut clean through the whispers. "That girl," she said, pointing at Evelyn with a hand that did not shake, "is no niece. I was here the day Margaret Conway arrived in this town, 17 years ago. She carried that child herself, swaddled and squalling. No sister ever came, no family but her. She has lied to us all." Gasps echoed. Heads turned, necks craned. Evelyn froze, her cheeks burning, her eyes wide with shame and something like relief. Arthur's jaw tightened. He had suspected, but suspicion was not the same as hearing the truth flung into the open. His gaze moved to Evelyn, who could not meet his eyes. Margaret, however, straightened with the poise of a soldier under fire. She drew her veil back, her face flushed but defiant. "Lies," she declared, her voice steady. "Baseless lies born of jealousy. I have raised Evelyn as my own, yes, but she is my sister's child, and I will not suffer slander in God's house." But the tide had turned. Reverend Whitlow did not reopen his book. Neighbours shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Mrs. Callahan's memory was too specific, too anchored in time for Margaret's denial to erase. Arthur stepped forward, his voice calm but hard. "Margaret, is it true?" The silence that followed stretched long enough for the truth to speak without words. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Evelyn trembled, caught between terror of exposure and the faintest flicker of release. The wedding was over before it began. The congregation spilled out of First Presbyterian like a hive struck by a stick. Their voices, low at first, rose in clusters along the church steps and spilled into the street. Whispers hardened into judgments, and judgments into verdicts. Imagine passing off her own child as a niece. Deceitful, scandalous, and the poor young man, humiliated before the whole town. Margaret swept down the steps with Evelyn clutched to her arm, her face set like stone. She did not flinch at the whispers, though she heard them plainly. A woman who had survived 17 years of careful invention could endure an hour of venom. She only tightened her grip on Evelyn, who stumbled to keep pace, her cheeks flaming. Arthur did not follow immediately. He remained behind a moment with Reverend Whitlow, whose face was pale with regret. "I could not go on," the minister said quietly, his Bible pressed against his chest. "The license, the rumors, it was a fraud against the altar." Arthur's voice was tight. "You could have spoken before this day." "I should have," Whitlow admitted, "but the Lord's truth comes when it must." Arthur left him without reply. By the time he reached the street, Margaret and Evelyn were gone, swallowed into the side alley that led to their home. The crowd had begun to thin, yet the echoes of talk clung to him like burrs. He caught fragments as he passed. Foolish man, poor girl, wicked woman. He felt heat in his chest, not shame for himself alone, but fury at being made a stage for Margaret's deception. That evening Davenport was alive with the scandal. At the Foundry boarding house, men shook their heads and clucked their tongues. In kitchens, wives leaned over stoves to repeat Mrs. Callahan's testimony word for word. Even the barber shop, where politics and the war usually dominated, buzzed with speculation about the Conways. At the Conway house, shutters were drawn tight. Margaret sat in her parlour with the gaslight dimmed, her wedding dress cast across a chair like a corpse. Evelyn sat near the window, her face hidden in her hands. "You must not weep," Margaret said firmly, her voice raw but controlled. "They will say it proves their malice correct. Hold your head high." Evelyn's shoulders trembled. "They know the truth, Mother." Margaret's head snapped around, her eyes blazing. "You will not call me that. Not now, not ever, do you hear? They may think they have unmasked me, but words can still be managed. Sister, aunt, whatever serves. We will endure." But her voice faltered. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the walls of her invention collapsing inward. Davenport was not a city where a woman could vanish into the crowd. Every corner of town carried eyes that knew her name, her face, her lie. Evelyn lifted her head, her eyes red but steady. "Perhaps it is better that it is known." Margaret stared at her as though struck. Better? To be ruined? To be gossiped about in every kitchen and pew? To see every chance at security destroyed? "It is not my ruin," Evelyn whispered, though she trembled as she spoke. "It is yours." The words landed between them like a blow. Margaret's hand twitched as though to strike, but she mastered herself. Her cleverness had always been in restraint, in calculation. She rose, smoothing her skirts, and said coldly, "You are nothing without me. Remember that." Arthur, meanwhile, sat alone in his lodgings. He stared at the lamp on the table, its glow steady, and felt the weight of the town pressing against his shoulders. He had prided himself on his judgment, on being a man not easily fooled. Yet he had allowed himself to be drawn into Margaret's orbit, ignoring the warning of his own instincts. But more troubling than anger was the memory of Evelyn's eyes in the lamplight, the way she had looked at him before Margaret returned to the room, the whispered confession that choice was not hers. He could not dismiss it as easily as he wished. In the days that followed, Davenport closed its doors to Margaret Conway. Shopkeepers served her briskly, without smile or greeting. Neighbors crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. The women who once entertained her at sewing circles found their parlors too small for company. Even the church, bound by Christian duty, welcomed her in silence but offered no hand of fellowship. For Evelyn, the isolation was both torment and strange relief. No longer was she paraded before suitors under false pretenses, no longer forced to wear the mask of niecehood. The lie was gone, and though shame clung to her, so too did the faintest breath of freedom. At night she dreamed of trains heading east, of city streets where no one knew her name. By day she sat at the window, her eyes following the smoke of locomotives as they passed. Margaret, however, hardened. Each whisper on the street, each averted glance, fed the steel in her spine. She had built her survival from ashes once before, and she told herself she could do it again. But the mirror betrayed her. The lines at her eyes could not be denied. The lie had collapsed, and with it the possibility of recasting herself anew. And always Arthur's absence weighed. She had believed, truly believed, that he might choose her despite the whispers, that his strength might bind itself to hers. Yet he did not come. He did not write. He did not call. In Davenport, reputation was currency, and Margaret Conway was bankrupt. But in Evelyn's quiet heart, something new had begun, the faint, steady rhythm of desire, for truth, for choice, for life beyond her mother's shadow. Winter crept over Davenport early that year. Frost laced the windows before November was through, and smoke from chimneys hung in the still air like grey ribbons. In every parlour and storefront, the story of Margaret Conway's ruined wedding remained as fresh as the snow that blanketed the streets. At the foundry, Arthur endured the gossip with clenched teeth. Men nudged one another when he passed, some with pity, others with sly amusement. "Fooled by a widow twice his age," they muttered. Arthur ignored them, keeping his back straight, his work precise, his hours long. But the sting did not fade. Yet in the quiet of evening, when the noise of molten iron no longer filled his ears, he found himself thinking not of Margaret, but of Evelyn. He remembered her whisper, "Choice is not always ours," and her eyes when the truth was spoken aloud in church. He told himself she was complicit, that she had played the role of niece willingly, but his heart rejected the thought. She had looked more prisoner than accomplice. Evelyn, meanwhile, lived in near-house arrest. Margaret allowed her no errands unaccompanied, no visits to neighbours, no letters unsupervised. "They are jackals," Margaret told her, standing tall in the dim light of the parlour. "They would devour you with their questions, twist your every word into evidence against us. I alone stand between you and their cruelty." At first Evelyn bowed her head as she always had, but inside her mind the words began to ring false. The town was cruel, yes, but Margaret's grip felt no gentler. When Margaret pressed her to play the piano for callers who no longer came, or to smile at suitors who no longer knocked, Evelyn realized with a jolt that the entire edifice of her life, the masks, the roles, the obedience, had been built on the single lie that now lay in ruins. One afternoon, as Margaret mended a lace cuff, Evelyn dared to speak. "If the truth is known," she said carefully, "then why should we keep pretending?" Margaret's needle stilled. "Because truth and gossip are not the same. The first can be endured, the second destroys. If we yield now, if we abandon our story, we are nothing." "I am already nothing," Evelyn whispered. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes hard. "You are my daughter, whether the town accepts it or not, and you will do as I say." The words slipped out before she could recall them. Margaret froze, realizing the admission she had forbidden herself to make aloud. Evelyn met her gaze, stunned but strangely calm. For the first time, Margaret had spoken truth to her face. It hung in the air like smoke that could not be drawn back into the fire. That night Evelyn dreamed again of trains, of the city beyond the Mississippi where no one cared what name she carried. Meanwhile, Arthur's path crossed hers in quieter ways. Once at the grocer's, where Margaret kept her close by her side, he saw Evelyn from across the aisle. She was thinner than he remembered, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. Their gazes met for the briefest moment, his steady, hers searching, and then Margaret's hand was on her arm, steering her away. Another time, he passed the Conway house on his walk home from the foundry and glimpsed Evelyn at the window, her face pressed to the glass like a prisoner at the bars. She did not wave, but their eyes met, and that was enough to set Arthur's thoughts ablaze again. The town's gossip did not fade. Mrs. Callahan, proud of her role in unmasking the lie, repeated the tale at every opportunity, polishing her memory until it gleamed with authority. The butcher's wife added embellishments. The barber compared Margaret to characters from dime novels of fallen women. Even the war overseas, where German U-boats prowled and men in Chicago talked of enlistment, could not wholly displace the scandal in Davenport's parlors. For Evelyn, each whisper carried to her through half-heard conversations on the street, each one a reminder of her chains. But rather than crush her, they began to forge something inside her, a hardness, a resolve she had never known. She no longer wept as she once had. Instead, she watched, she listened, and she began to think not only of endurance, but of escape. Margaret sensed it. She doubled her vigilance, inventing reasons to keep Evelyn at home, scolding her for imagined slights, insisting that Arthur's silence was proof that he had never truly cared. But at night, when Margaret sat awake by the fire, she felt the unease pressing against her own heart. The town had stripped her of her standing. Her beauty waned despite her careful disguises, and her daughter's eyes no longer bowed but met hers with steady, questioning fire. For Margaret, it was a battle to preserve what remained. For Evelyn, it was the first stirrings of freedom. And for Arthur, watching from the edge of town, it was the beginning of a choice that would test not just his pride, but his courage. By December, Davenport lay beneath snow, its streets crunching with sleigh runners and boots. Icicles hung like glass teeth from eaves, and smoke from the foundry rose thick against the grey sky. The gossip about Margaret Conway had dulled but not vanished. In a small town, scandal never disappeared, it only hardened into a permanent stain. Arthur bore it as best he could. At the foundry, men still muttered when he passed. Almost married his own mother-in-law, someone joked once, too loudly. Arthur's fist tightened, but he did not turn. Instead, he worked harder, longer, his body carrying the weight of humiliation so his mind might be free to think of Evelyn. He had tried to dismiss her, tried to remind himself that she was part of the lie, that her silence had aided it. But whenever he passed the Conway house and saw her shadow in the window, whenever he remembered the tremor in her voice at the church, choice is not always ours. He knew she was no co-conspirator. She was a captive. Evelyn's captivity grew heavier with each passing week. Margaret kept her close, forbade her from errands alone, and spoke constantly of appearances. "They watch us still," Margaret insisted one morning, adjusting the pins in her hair before the mirror. "They wait for us to falter, to admit to shame. We must be above them." Evelyn nodded, but inwardly she seethed. Above them? She felt only below, beneath suspicion, beneath gossip, beneath Margaret's iron hand. Her first act of rebellion was small, a glance. Walking back from church with her mother one afternoon, She caught Arthur's eye across the snowy street. Instead of lowering her gaze, as she always had, she held it. Just a heartbeat longer than was safe, but enough for him to see it. Her plea, her defiance, her unspoken cry. Margaret tugged her arm sharply. "Mind your step," she said, not noticing what had passed. The second act was bolder. One evening, when Margaret had gone to bed, Evelyn crept to the parlour desk. She pulled a scrap of paper from the drawer and wrote in a trembling hand, "Meet me, if you still wish to know the truth, tonight, by the bridge." She folded it, slid it into her coat, and prayed for courage. The next day she found her chance, slipping the note into Arthur's coat pocket as she passed him at the grocer's. That night, beneath a sky thick with stars and the frozen Mississippi whispering below, Arthur waited by the bridge. The cold cut through his coat, but his heart pounded hot. He had half feared the note a trap, half hoped it a dream. But when Evelyn appeared, her shawl tight around her, her breath clouding the air, he knew it was real. For a long moment they stood apart, silent. Then Arthur spoke. "Evelyn, you should not have come." "I had to," she whispered. "I cannot breathe in that house." He stepped closer, searching her face. "You were part of it. You played the role." "I obeyed," she said, her eyes shining. "Obedience is not the same as choice." The words struck him with force. He reached for her hand, hesitated, then took it, the warmth of her fingers startling against the cold. "Why now?" he asked. "Because they all know," she said. "The lie is dead, but I am still trapped inside it. I cannot endure it much longer." Arthur's breath came hard. "You risk much to meet me, and you risk more to be seen with me," she answered softly. They stood in silence, the river ice cracking faintly beneath them, the stars wheeling above. For a moment, it felt as if the whole world had narrowed to that bridge, that night, that touch of hands. But then Evelyn pulled back. "I must go," she said quickly. "If she suspects, she will never let me out again." Arthur's grip tightened. "Evelyn, wait." She shook her head, eyes wide. "Not now, but soon. Promise me you will wait." And then she was gone, vanishing into the snow, leaving Arthur alone with the river and the knowledge that his life had already shifted course. Back at the Conway house, Margaret stirred in her sleep. A dream had troubled her, Evelyn slipping away, eyes blazing with defiance. When she woke, she lay still, listening. The house was silent, but her unease remained. For the first time, Margaret felt not only the world's betrayal, but her daughter's. And in the town beyond, talk of the war across the ocean grew louder. Men in Davenport debated enlistment, women spoke of suffrage marches in Chicago, but always, beneath it all, the name Conway drifted like smoke. A warning, a scandal, a story that would not die. Winter deepened, and with it Margaret's vigilance. She watched Evelyn more closely now, sensing currents she could not name. Whenever Evelyn lingered at the window or dawdled at errands, Margaret's voice cut sharp. "Do not think the world is kinder than I. They will eat you alive." But Evelyn no longer believed her. After that night at the bridge, she carried Arthur's touch like a secret ember in her chest. Each day she fanned it with quiet defiance. An extra moment spent alone in the yard, a reply to Margaret that was not quite submissive, the strength to meet her own reflection in the mirror and whisper, "I am not yours to keep." Arthur, too, changed. Where once he moved through town in silence, enduring jests and pity, now he worked with a kind of grim resolve. He saved every spare dollar, took on night shifts at the rail yard, and quietly rented a room above the cooper's shop under another name. In that room he kept a single trunk, slowly filling it with what they would need: sturdy shoes, a second-hand coat for Evelyn, bread wrapped in cloth. The world beyond Davenport pressed closer. In January of 1916, newspapers on the corner shouted of U-boats sinking ships, of Wilson preparing America for war. In the depot, young men argued about whether they would be called to fight. To Arthur, it felt as though the whole country was on the edge of something vast and terrible. He could not let Evelyn's life shrink to nothing while the world roared into change. They met twice more in secret, each time at the bridge. The second meeting, Evelyn brought coins she had hidden from Margaret's purse. The third, she whispered, "She will not let me go willingly. You must be ready." And Arthur answered, "Then we will not ask." The night of their flight came with a heavy snow, the streets muffled and white. Evelyn waited until Margaret slept, her mother's breathing deep and uneven. She rose, dressed quickly, and paused at the parlor door. For a moment she almost turned back, but then she imagined growing old in that house, watching years vanish under Margaret's shadow, and she slipped outside. Arthur was waiting with a borrowed sleigh, the horse stamping in the cold. He lifted her up beside him, wrapped the blanket tight around her, and urged the horse forward toward the depot. But Margaret was not asleep. Some instinct had roused her, and when she found Evelyn's bed empty, rage flooded her veins. She threw on her cloak and followed the sleigh's tracks through the snow, her lantern swinging wildly. She reached the depot just as Arthur and Evelyn stood at the platform, the whistle of the midnight train shrieking through the air. "Evelyn!" Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. Her figure loomed in the snow, black cloak billowing. "Do not dare leave me. You are mine." The crowd on the platform turned, whispers rising like sparks. Evelyn froze, her hand in Arthur's, her breath shallow. The pull of her mother's voice, sharp and commanding as ever, dragged at her bones. For 19 years she had obeyed that voice. But Arthur's grip steadied her. "No," he said quietly, fiercely. "You are not hers. Not any more." Evelyn turned. For the first time in her life, she looked Margaret in the eye and did not flinch. Her voice trembled, but it carried, "I am not yours to own. I am your daughter, not your shadow." Margaret's face twisted, half in fury, half in desperation. She took a step forward, but the conductor's call broke through the night. "All aboard for Chicago." The crowd surged, blocking her path. Arthur pulled Evelyn up onto the train. She stumbled, then found her footing. The whistle screamed again, the wheels groaned, and slowly the train began to move. Margaret lunged forward, her lantern swinging, but the platform edge stopped her. She shouted Evelyn's name into the night, her voice swallowed by steam and iron. For one instant Evelyn looked back, seeing her mother small and furious in the snow. Then the train carried her away. Arthur sat beside her, breath ragged, hand gripping hers. Neither spoke. The train rattled on, carrying them out of Davenport, out of scandal, out of Margaret's reach, though not, Evelyn knew, out of her memory. The lights of the town dwindled. Ahead lay Chicago, vast and unknown, full of hardship and promise. Behind lay Margaret Conway, alone with her house, her lies, and the silence of the town that would never forgive her. The train carried Arthur and Evelyn into Chicago at dawn. Smoke hung thick above the rail yards, whistles shrieked, and the streets boiled with people rushing in every direction. For Evelyn, it was dizzying, the clamour, the speed, the anonymity. She had dreamed of escape, but now the sheer size of freedom frightened her. Arthur sensed it. He guided her gently through the station, his arm steady at her back. "One step at a time," he said. "We'll make a place here. Might be small at first, might be hard, but it'll be ours." They rented a single room on Halsted Street, 4 flights up, with one narrow window that looked onto a brick wall. The pipes rattled, coal smoke seeped under the door, and every dollar Arthur earned at the rail yard seemed to vanish the moment it was made. But Evelyn did not complain. She washed their clothes in the tin basin, cooked what little she could afford, and stood at the window listening to the clatter of the city. She was poor, exhausted, and sometimes frightened, but she was free. At night, when Arthur returned with his hands raw and blackened from labor, they sat close by the oil lamp. They spoke little at first, but slowly, cautiously, they began to share the words they had never dared to speak in Davenport. Each word was like a brick laid down, the beginning of something sturdy. Back in Davenport, the silence around Margaret Conway thickened. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Women lowered their voices when she entered the grocer's. Even the pastor, who had once praised her generosity, visited less often. She had been formidable, glamorous, commanding, but now she was simply exposed. She stopped attending church. The curtains of her house remained drawn. She dismissed the girl who came to help with laundry, preferring solitude to pity. Day by day, her world contracted to the rooms of her own making, and yet she did not collapse into madness or tears. She read voraciously, scribbled notes in the margins of books, and composed letters she never sent. She told herself she had been wronged, that Evelyn had betrayed her. Sometimes she almost believed it. But always at night, when the house was quiet, she remembered the look in Evelyn's eyes on the platform, the look that had broken her control forever. The town made its peace with the scandal by folding it into its stories. Children whispered about the widow who married her lie. Women used Margaret's name as a warning. Do not end like her. Men at the foundry spoke of Arthur with grudging respect now, not for his dignity in Davenport, but for his audacity in leaving it. The Conways became legend, half pity, half condemnation. Years later, travellers on the train would still glance at the old Conway house on the hill, shutters closed tight, and murmur of the woman who lived alone inside. Some said she was still waiting for Evelyn to return. Others said she never forgave her daughter and carried her rage to the grave. But in Chicago, Evelyn did not look back. She built her life day by day, small and imperfect, with Arthur at her side. There were quarrels, there were lean months, there was sorrow, but also laughter, warmth, and choice. She carried Margaret with her always, not as a chain but as a shadow, a reminder of what she had escaped. And though the memory of Davenport sometimes haunted her dreams, Evelyn woke each morning to the clamour of the city, the smell of coal and bread and horse dung, the vastness of a world that was finally hers. Evelyn found freedom, Margaret found silence, and Arthur found grit. But what would you have done? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to Eternal Obsidian for more stories that burn long after the last word.